Um, and before I sort of delve into my paper or my talk, I wanted to just mention the fact that this reflection sits in the context of a broader range of um, engagements with questions of abstraction that I've undertaken over the years. Some that Jens mentioned in terms of the issue of real abstraction and the critical commentary and interpretation of the work of Alfred Zunrettel. In many ways, though, the first engagement with, or my kind of first preoccupation with the problem of abstraction was perhaps of a more political nature or in a more political register. And it really had to do with the question of the passion for and the condemnation of abstraction, especially in the nexus of politics and religion, as they became, an issue of extreme controversy and, agitation in the context, especially of the so-called war on terror. And that's a subject that I tried to tackle in my book, Fanaticism, where I also tried to revisit bringing together questions of politics, religion, and capital, Marx's own writings of abstraction. And it was sort of on that basis that I then tried to discern and revisit and recover that debate on real and on social abstraction that crystallizes in the writings of Zunrettel, but of course can also be seen to course through much of the writing of the Institute for Social Research, especially the work of Theodor Adorno, who of course was a lifelong interlocutor in many ways of Zunrettel. And then, of course, a whole set of other strands and veins of critical theory and philosophy, including 1960s and 70s debates within the domain of French philosophy, so-called post-structuralism, on questions of money, capital, and abstraction. More recently, and Jens also alluded to that in his generous introduction, I've been really reflecting on the question of the place of both the phobia, but also the kind of reification or pseudo-concrete crystallization of abstractions in fascist thought, fascist regimes, fascist movements. So that is definitely a strand also in the book. Late Fascism was dealing with this question of real abstraction as it pertained to the political and the racial and the economic imaginaries and practices of fascism, especially via a rather neglected but I think very significant book from the 1930s, co-authored by Henri Lefebvre and Norbert Gutermann, called La Conscience Mystifiée, a book where, and I haven't been able to trace to what extent this had any relation to Zunrettel, since they were all to some extent in the orbit of the Institute for Social Research, where Gutermann and Lefebvre also use this expression of real abstraction in their critique of the place of the philosophy and metaphysics of spirit in fascist thought. And last but not least, and rather closer to the topic of this evening's talk, is the issue pithily encapsulated by Stuart Hall in his essay from 2013, Isaac Julian's Workshop, the problem of how to visualize an abstraction, especially how to visualize the abstractions or indeed the real abstractions of capital, which was, of course, the principal concern and preoccupation and research problem of the book I co-authored with Jeff Kinkle, Cartographies of the Absolute. So what I wanted to do this evening was to reflect on the place of race, racialization, and racism in this broad and complex and multi-level field of debates and analyses and conceptualizations of abstraction, and then to think through the place of the visual in the nexus of race and abstraction, and to do so at least in part through an engagement with the writings of Stuart Hall as well as of Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And indeed, I wanted to begin just to set the stage for this exploration of the question of race, abstraction, and the visual with a quote from the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and specifically an essay which takes its title from an expression by Stuart Hall. This is the essay, Fatal Couplings of Power and Difference, Notes on Race and Geography, a text that's included in, or was reprinted in the collection that I edited alongside Brenna Bandar, Abolition Geography collection of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's essays. Gilmore writes the following. She says, racism is a practice of abstraction. I think it's that formulation, of course, of yoking abstraction to practice will be key for the rest of my argument. A practice of abstraction, a death-dealing displacement of difference into hierarchies that organize relations within and between the planet's sovereign political territories. Racism functions as a limiting force that pushes disproportionate costs of participating in an increasingly monetized and profit-driven world onto those who, due to the frictions of political distance, cannot reach the variable levers of power that might relieve them of those costs. And indeed, one could probably spend the 45 minutes or more left to us just unpacking this passage. I wanted to at least underscore some elements that I think are interesting for a discussion, namely the identification of the question of abstraction and its practice with this reification or transcoding of difference into hierarchy, and of course the prism of a historical materialist geography, and indeed a study of spatialization through which Gilmore approaches this question. That, of course, gives a concreteness, but also political and a kind of antagonistic register to questions that might otherwise be treated in a kind of a homogenizing or flattening way, questions of monetization, profit, accumulation, and of course the violence that invariably accompanies them. I think in order to approach this matter of race and abstraction, it's also both useful and significant to be sensitive to, or to open up our perception to the polysemic, multiple layered character of the abstract, right? To the abstraction not simply as a separation, as an impoverishment, as a hollowing out, but actually abstraction understood also as a process and a practice of determination and difference. And here I take inspiration from the ways in which the problem, indeed the methodological problem for Marxism and critical and social theory more broadly, of abstraction is formulated in the writings of Stuart Hall. Hall, both in his collective work in the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies, as well as in so many of his writings, really ruminated, so to speak, for many years, the methodological problems and analytical resources advanced by Marx, especially in his preparatory notes for what would eventually become Capital, namely the Grundrisse. And amongst the texts in which Hall engages with this question, there is an extremely rich and still, I think, very vital essay that he writes on Gramsci's relevance to the study of race, where he writes the following, and I wanted to draw on this quote really to think through, again, abstraction as a matter of determination, differentiation, but also abstraction as, in many ways, a plural and historicized and complex formation. So Hall writes the following. He says, Marx himself, in his most elaborated methodological text, his 1857 introduction to the Grundrisse, envisaged the production of the concrete in thought. And this, of course, is also a formulation that was significant for another one of Hall's interlocutors, namely Louis Althusser, as taking place through a succession of analytic approximations, each adding further levels of determination. So here abstraction does not impoverish or subtract, but in many ways adds, supplements, complexifies, to the necessarily skeletal and abstract concepts formed at the highest level of analytical abstraction, right? So we have abstraction happening, again, at different levels and different modalities. Marx argued that we could only think the concrete through these successive levels of abstraction. That was because the concrete, in reality, consisted of many determinations, which, of course, the levels of abstraction we use to think about it with must approximate in thought. Now, what I wanted to really dwell on here is what I think is an extremely significant, salient, still very relevant dimension of Hall's work, of his theorization of the relationship between race, capital, abstraction, which is namely the fact that to understand the nexus of abstraction and race, to understand race through the prism of what a number of Marxian or Marxist authors have called the violence of abstraction, is not to treat racism or racialization or race as homogeneous, as one, as the same, as invariant. And where in other concurrent and contemporaneous essays, Hall draws on Althusser's work to grasp this question of the differentiation, the differentiability of race and racism in the context of historical capitalism. Here he draws on Gramsci. He draws on Gramsci as well as on his own reflections on and analytical and empirical studies of racism in the long history of the British Empire. And he makes the following point, which I wanted to work through a little bit of length. He says, no doubt there are certain general features to racism. And here, of course, he's also resonating with the question of the general in Marx, right? When Marx distinguishes labor in general from abstract labor in his methodological text on capital. But even more, Stuart Hall continues, even more significant are the ways in which these general features are modified and transformed by the historical specificity of the context and environments in which they become active. In the analysis of particular historical forms of racism, we would do well to operate at a more concrete, historicized level of abstraction, right? So abstraction does not at all necessarily mean a flight from or an escape from concreteness and historicity, but rather it's a determination. That is, he continues, not racism in general, but racisms. Even within the limited case that I know best, that is Britain, he continues, I would say that the differences between British racism in its high imperial period and the racism which characterizes the British social formation now, and Hall is here writing in the 1980s, we also reflect on how that formation has mutated or indeed further declined in the present. in a period of relative economic decline, when the issue is confronted not in the colonial setting, but as part of the indigenous labor force and regime of accumulation within the domestic economy, are greater and more significant than the similarities. And here I think we could also fruitfully bring Hall into dialogue and conversation with the writings of Cedric Robinson, especially with his conception of the racial regime as laid out in the book Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, in passages that have also been analyzed by Brenna Bander in the introduction to her book, Colonial Lives of Property, bringing together the work indeed of Robinson and Hall. Hall continues, it is often little more than a gestural stance which persuades us to the misleading view. So this would be in a sense the bad abstraction or the misplaced abstraction, the misleading view. Because racism is everywhere deeply anti-human and anti-social practice, it is therefore everywhere the same, either in its forms, its relation to other structures and processes, or its effects. Gramsci does, I believe, help us to interrupt decisively this homogenization. Racism and racist practices and structures frequently occur in some, but not all sectors of the social formation. Their impact is penetrative, but uneven, and their very unevenness of impact may help to deepen and exacerbate these contradictory sectoral antagonisms. In writings, again, from the time where Hall draws, as I said, not just on the work of Gramsci, but also in the work of Althusser, including a remarkable essay called Signification, Representation, Ideology, Althusser and the Post-Structuralist Debates. Hall has some very both theoretically astute and complex, but also biographically or even intimately revealing reflections on what this displacement of difference into hierarchy and this differentiation and historicity of racial regimes concretely mean. I was struck in particular by the way in which this essay presents the differences, the difference in code and power and operation between two racial regimes that in his own personal biography, Hall traversed, namely the system of Caribbean racialization, namely in his own experience in his native Jamaica, and the particular colonial legacies that it continued to manifest, and the system yoking together race, abstraction, difference, and discourse in the English context. And it is in this essay where Hall tells us, right, as he puts it here, that the Caribbean system was organized through the finely graded classification systems, right? Other practices of discursive and taxonomic abstraction, right? Finely graded classification systems of the colonial discourses of race, arranged on an ascending scale, again, difference into hierarchy, to bring up Gilmore's initial formulation, up to the ultimate white term, the latter always out of reach, the impossible absent term, whose absent presence structured the whole chain. So it's particularly striking here that Hall is, of course, bringing his own extremely concrete experience of racialization in Jamaica to bear on some of the more seemingly forbidding or abstruse formulations in structuralist and post-structuralist thought, not least the question of an absent present center. In the bitter struggle for place and position, which characterizes dependent societies, every notch on the scale mattered profoundly. And then to show again how racism is by no means always the same, even in the same empire or in the same kind of post-colonial system. The English system, by contrast, was organized around a simpler binary dichotomy more appropriate to the colonizing order: white, not white. Meaning is not a transparent reflection of the world and language, but arises through the differences between the terms and categories of systems of reference, which classify out the world and allow it to be in this way appropriated into social thought. So, and then he continues later in the essay using this kind of leitmotif in his work on abstraction and on race, which is this idea of articulation, to think through how the specific discursive, abstractive, classifying figures of race and of the power that accompanied it in the Jamaican context ended up, of course, putting the discourse of race, color, ethnicity in a dominant position vis-a-vis that of class, again, showing how levels of abstraction, right? Class, race, ethnicity, or indeed gender can be recombined and rearticulated in different historical conjunctures as well as in different geographies. In a work now from a decade ago with Brenna Banda that draws on the work of Stuart Hall in particular, we tried to argue, we tried to set out the ways in which it's extremely important for discussions around the politics and indeed the political economy of abstraction not to fall into the trap of homogeneity or that trap of unity that Hall is warning us about, and to really think about the multiplicity as well as the intersection, interlocking, and articulation of different practices and devices of abstraction that, given different historical conjunctures or moments, can be either dominant or residual or hegemonic. And we put it as follows, trying to at least grasp some of the ranges, right? And so indeed some of the levels of abstraction that are germane to such an analysis in the following way. What we would seem to require, and I think we still stick by this formulation, what we would seem to require is a way of thinking the articulation between distinct and sometimes independent modalities of abstraction. We would need to be able to think the articulation between events and processes of abstraction dissolution, for instance, moments of primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession, the unconscious abstracting of social processes as grasped, for instance, in Zohetel's account of the exchange abstraction or real abstraction, the high-level logic of abstraction intrinsic to value, as a social form of capitalism, and the relatively autonomous and deliberate practices and devices of abstraction, scientific, mathematical, linguistic, but also political and juridical, that are either articulated with a real abstraction or opposed by it as its presuppositions. Now, where does this discussion go when it comes to the question of visual? I think here we can, again, at least for a moment, continue to dwell with the writing of Stuart Hall, specifically with commentaries on the writing of Frantz Fanon, especially Black Skin, White Masks, that he wrote in the context of debates in the 1980s and 90s that brought Fanon together with psychoanalysis, visual culture, and indeed visual art. And helpfully, Hall underscores one extremely significant dimension of both corporeality, indeed even physiological as well as psychoanalytic experience, and abstraction, which is grasped in Fanon's formulation of the epidermalization of race and indeed of colonial and anti-Black systems of racial inferiority. Hall calls this a wonderful word, of course, not a word for a wonderful phenomenon, but a particularly astute and determinate word, notwithstanding, or perhaps because of its abstraction. Epidermalization here defines the inscription of race on the skin. And what's interesting here is, of course, that in his reading of Fanon, Hall underscores the cultural and discursive, again, also in the sense of classifying, signifying, and in its own way, abstract nature of the problem of epidermalization in Fanon, and links the violence, the corporeal violence of his abstraction also to the structure and the violence of looking, drawing, of course, on Fanon's engagement both with the writings of Jacques Lacan and of Jean-Paul Sartre on question of the look and the gaze. And here again is another way in which, to echo and return to Gilmore's formulation, we can think about that relationship between difference and hierarchy as something which is enacted and embodied in visual practice. It is the exercise of power through the dialectic of the look, Hall writes, commenting on Fanon, race in the field of vision, to paraphrase Jacqueline Rose, which fixes, right? Fixes in the sense of that you would fix a photograph of a photographic plate through chemicals, that you would resolve a problem, that you would fix in the sense of bind someone or something, right? Again, another activity that you could say very much speaks to the violence of abstraction, which fixes the Negro from the outside. Fanon's word, which I will use in this context, by the phantasmatic binary of absolute difference. Yeah, of course, absolute difference is indeed also an abstract and a hierarchical difference. Not only is Fanon's Negro caught, transfixed, emptied, and exploded in the fetishistic and stereotypical dialectics of the look from replacing the other, but he, she has no other self, and this self as other. And in this essay, again, I want to underscore the way in which Hall links the corporeal and psychoanalytical and libidinal dimensions of race and racialization as read through the work of Fanon to the question of abstraction, which here takes the name of taxonomy, again, going back to that key issue in racial regimes and racial thought, which is that of classification. As he puts it, in the epidermalization of the racial look, Fanon tells us, exclusion and abjection are imprinted on the body, right? He's almost talking about this a little bit like, you might think of Kafka's penal colony, right? Imprinted on the body through the functioning of these signifiers, right? Abstract linguistic tokens as an objective taxonomy, a taxidermy of radicalized difference, a specular matrix of intelligibility. And you could say a kind of real racial abstraction that is inscribed onto the body, onto the skin. It is therefore sometimes tempting, Hall continues, to believe that these are indeed the evidence rather than the markers of difference, right? So that there is very often, right, in both conscious racial thought and unconscious racial practice, what we could call, paraphrasing Alfred North Whitehead, right, a fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is the idea that somehow physiological skin difference signifies of its own accord, right, rather than having to be mediated by all sorts of levels and practices of abstraction or regimes, racial regimes of difference. We mistake their function, he says, as signifiers for their biological fact, and thus read race as the product of a genetic or biological schema, rather than as a discursive regime, right? Rather than as an abstraction or a set of plural, historically specific and geographically coded abstractions. Here we can, I think, also return to the work of Gilmore, who, again, in dialogue and commentary with Paul himself in the essay fatal couplings, points, right, how this practice of violence abstraction is specifically, right, inscribed into and articulated on bodies, right? The process of abstraction that signifies racism produces effects at the most intimately sovereign scale insofar as particular kinds of bodies, one by one, are materially, if not always visibly, configured by racism into a hierarchy of human and inhuman persons that in some form the category human being. And for Gilmore as well, of course, as for Hall in his writings on the racial regimes of Jamaica and England, racial abstraction is, right, a biographical, an intimate, a subjective, a lived experience, right? As she puts it, a substantive category of my political identity became overtly and publicly metaphorical, symbolic, comparative, abstract. This, as she puts it in her essay, in the wake of the judgment that declared the innocence of the LAPD cops who brutalized Rodney King in the eve of the LA uprising. This was a violently abstract work of Blackness in the US. Violently abstract work that, of course, stands behind the nature of racism, as she puts it, in a famous definition and formulation as a state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. And just to move towards my conclusion, I find it striking, especially in the context of the present moment, rather dire present conjuncture, that, of course, in Gilmore's work, as well as in the essay that Cedric Robinson contributed to the same collection, in which Gilmore writes about the Rodney King beating, reading Rodney King, reading Urban Riots. The other side, right, of the violent abstraction of violent abstraction of Blackness and Black experience in the US is, of course, the violence of the racial abstraction of white nationalism, right, as a kind of crisis ideology. As she puts it, I think in words that are perfectly apt for our own moment 30 years later, the idea and enactment of winning, of explicit domination set against the local reality of decreasing family wealth, fear of unemployment, threat of homelessness, and increased likelihood of early painful death from capitalism's many toxicities. These are, the spectral abstractions of whiteness that also haunt the violence of the present. And this is what is also, right, underscored in Robinson's own formulation regarding an America principally driven by nationalism, militarism, and racism, an American majority with a renewed consciousness of its external and domestic enemies, an American majority sobered through a long period of declining incomes and unsatisfied desires. And again, I think there is something to be thought about in this nexus of decline, racialization, abstraction, and violence. It was in the context of the televised, video recorded beating of Rodney King by the Los Angeles Police Department, and of the subsequent trial and acquittal of those officers, that some, I think, very interesting and still useful reflections on the question of the racialization of the visual field and place of the practice of abstraction in that were made, again, in the same collection, reading Rodney King, reading Urban Riots, that Gilmore and Robinson's essay was in. And I'm thinking of specifically of a really compelling essay by Judith Butler, where they work through the way, right, in which to Many critical, progressive, anti-racist commentators seem to be the evidence, right? Like the visual evidence of racist violence and brutality was actually recoded, reinterpreted, represented, right? In terms of the threats experienced by the police, right? Something that, in a different but nevertheless, uh, uh, um, interlinked register we've seen very recently again in the ICE murder of Renee Good in Minneapolis. Butler puts it as follows. They say, how is this feat of interpretation achieved, right? Like the feat of interpretation that presented, right, the brutalized, beaten Rodney King as the threat, right, to this, gaggle of police who were, assaulting him viciously. That it was achieved, they continue, is not the consequence of ignoring the video, but rather of reproducing the video within a racially saturated field of visibility, right? So this is another part of the practice of racial abstraction, is that of racially saturating the field of visibility, of functioning as a presupposition. How do we account for this reversal of gesture and intention in terms of a racial schematization of the visible field? It's not a simple seeing, an act of direct perception, but the racial production of the visible, right? And I think this is also, of course, something that Paul is trying to draw out of the work of Frantz Fanon. The workings of racial constraints on what it means to see. So, what I really just wanted to do in the context of our conversation this evening is really to link, right, this racism as a practice of abstraction to and a violent practice of abstraction to the racial production of the visible. Again, this is a perception and an analysis that draws on the work of Frantz Fanon, an explicit reference also in Butler's writing, and is really trying to frame, right, what would it mean also to engage in forms of contrasting, antagonistic, even perhaps counter-hegemonic interpretation and practice. As they put it, if the field of the visible is racially contested terrain, then it will be politically imperative to read such videos aggressively, to repeat and publicize such readings, if only to further an anti-racist hegemony over the visual field. And I think with that final quote, I think I'll just bring my talk to a close, and hopefully we can open it up for questions and comments.